Welcome everybody, and thanks for joining my presentation today at the AsyncAPI Conference. And I'm really happy to be here. It's called Patterns for Event-Driven APIs. And the way I came up with that topic was to look at how people are using APIs, where they come from, and maybe different ways, and how you can look at events and how you want to use them in your APIs and in your overall API landscape. Before I get started, just a very brief introduction about myself and what I do. So my name is Erik Wilde. I work for Axway. So we are a company producing API management software for mostly large organizations who are interested in managing their API landscapes. One thing that I want to pitch very briefly is when Corona happened, I pivoted a little bit to also producing videos because I was doing a lot of conference presentations and presentations at clients. And I am keeping that up. So in case you're interested in API content, check out my channel. You'll find me on YouTube. Just search for my name. I publish interviews with people and sometimes just about topics that I find interesting. And I do all of this as part of my work in the Axway Catalyst team. We're a small team, and our goal is to help organizations to use APIs in a better way. And oftentimes that means to talk to them about what do we even want to do with APIs, right? So not so much to dive into the details of, in the good old REST days, right, which HTTP method are you using, which maybe is an interesting discussion to have, but oftentimes it's more about what are you even trying to achieve, and is that a good direction to go in? And that's also the motivation for my presentation today. So one of the things you could ask yourself is a little bit, and I'm showing you here the hype curves that I'm sure you've all seen, right? Have we reached peak event? Events have become something that is being talked about a lot, and that's good. And it's something, if you just look at the API space, then you could say it's just another kind of hype curve that's happening, right? So we had SOAP, which maybe was the initial wave of API popularity. Then REST came along and said, oh, SOAP is not good, you should all use REST. Then for a little while, we had GraphQL came along, and everybody said, oh, GraphQL, it's the new thing, right? Everything's better in GraphQL. And now we kind of have the same thing, maybe, for events. And I'm really not trying to diss any of these things. I think these are all good contributions to how to design APIs and how to make sure that you get the most out of your APIs and the consumers of APIs have something useful to work with. So I think the more interesting question really is not so much have we reached peak event, but have we reached peak API, right? Is that something that happens at some point where overall the popularity of the API space will be reduced? And I think that's definitely not the case. So I think the API community as a whole, as well as those individual, let's say, sub-communities like event space and maybe GraphQL space, right? I mean, we're all participating in a environment that I say is still very robustly growing. And you can kind of look for any study that you're interested in. I just picked one more or less at random after Googling where's the API market going. And you will always see that the predictions are the API market is growing at a very robust and let's say long-term projected pace. And the reasons for that, I think, are fairly obvious, right? One is that more and more things are getting digitalized. So we just have more and more things that become available in a digital way. And I think we also see that more and more organizations are understanding that when they use APIs, they can start doing things that they couldn't do before. So they either can be more competitive, or they can just at least not be outperformed by the competition. And therefore, in my mind, just looking at the API space, we definitely still have a good path ahead of us, regardless of maybe what the next hype may look like. But one of the things that I always encounter, and this is a little bit a motivation for my presentation today, is there is sometimes this idea of just by using APIs or maybe just by using events, right? Magically, great things will happen. And that's not the case. And I have those two lovely people here that I'm watching the comments. So anybody who recognizes those people in the movie this is from, please let me know. You may know it. It's a silly movie, but it's two people who are not overly bright, very nice though. And that's just the example. Sometimes what I see in organizations that they say, oh, when we use APIs, wonderful things will happen. Right? And that's not necessarily the case. So you have to make sure that you actually use the right APIs. So for example, that you use APIs that actually drive your business goals and not just some random APIs, some very technical APIs. So there is I think, a need for us also in the API community to better understand what people really want to do. And one of the things that I really liked that in my recent videos was with Stephen Bungay. So Stephen Bungay is a management consultant, and I loved his way of putting how to make APIs or anything else for that matter more successful. And I'm sure you will never forget this once you hear that. So what he says is you always have to ask the Spice Girls question. And the Spice Girls question is, tell me what you want. Tell me what you really, really want. And I think this is really important to keep in mind, because in the end, the maybe slightly controversial claim you could make is to say nobody really wants APIs. Right? APIs are just a technical thing. Nobody really wants APIs. What people want are to get things done with APIs, and APIs help them. But we also have to make sure that we understand what people really want to get done with APIs, instead of just shouting at them, you should use REST, you should use GraphQL, you should use events, right? And I think this is always a very good thing to keep in mind, that APIs are just something to get stuff done. And I think in the event space, there is a similar thing, that you can get different things done with events. And this is what I want to do today, is just to talk you through different patterns of how you can use events, and to always be mindful that if you're using events, if you're using environments where people say maybe we should do event-driven things, right? Always also take a step back and ask why. Like, why would that be a good solution? Maybe why would that be a better solution than the one we have or the one we alternatively consider? And just think through, is that really where we want to go? And the reason why this is an important question is that events cover a very, very wide spectrum, right? There are very, let's say, simple, and I would say ephemeral events, where you could say these events are really not all that important, so to speak. So I spend a lot of time in the Internet of Things and Web of Things space, right? And there are things such as sensor readings, right? So for example, if you're a temperature sensor, then it may emit regular readings, like every minute, something like this. And this is interesting, but it also really is not such a bad thing if you miss those readings, right? So these would be events where you say, well, yeah, if I listen to that sensor and I get the latest reading, that's fine. I know what the room temperature is, but if I miss that reading, not such a big deal, right? So that would be a not so important event. Other events may be different. So for example, there may be events where already you would want to have some historical data. For example, if there is a sensor that measures when heating is going on and off, maybe that's something where you really want to know, even looking back, right? When did the heating system turn on? When did it turn off? So that you can maybe monitor energy consumption or whatever it is that you want to do. And then there are even other events that are extremely critical, right? So for example, if somebody withdraws money from an account, that's a really important event, right? If you forget about that event, the whole accounting system won't really work anymore. So this big spectrum of events, I think, is important to keep in mind, that if we talk about events, that is just something that, okay, it's an event that happens, but these events can have very different relevance for a business. And I think that's important to keep in mind. And what I want to do today is just walk you through those different patterns of things you can build and different approaches that people are taking, just to give you a little bit better idea of what are we even doing here. And maybe not so much just about one API, but also what are we doing for the API landscape? What is our approach to using events? And that is something that may be interesting. So let's look at this spectrum of patterns for event APIs. If we start with a very basic idea, then we can start with saying, at the very basic level, an event-based API is just an API that reverses the control flow of our typical request-driven APIs. Instead of waiting for a request coming in from a client, that API will emit those events. There is a way of how you can listen to those, and then you get notified of the things that happen. That's kind of the very fundamental and basic definition of what an event API looks like. And it's relatively limited because you have to be there listening while those API events happen, but it's useful. And there are some protocols, and I'll just give you some examples that kind of originate from that space. They also do more things, both of the examples that I'm giving you. So here we'll be talking about AMQP. I'm also be talking about XMPP, MQTT, sorry, didn't pick XMPP. But the main thing that I want to talk about here is that these are kind of event delivery protocols. Right? So AMQP is a protocol that if you as a client implement AMQP, it's a way of how events will be delivered to you. AMQP originates in the financial sector. So it was something where organizations wanted to have a protocol if you have trading data or you have a stock, how do you call these, the stock quotes coming in at a regular rate, right? These may be information that you want to work with, and AMQP specifically tried to make that very efficient because, as we all know, for financial information, sometimes the efficiency of these delivery mechanisms is very important because it's time-sensitive information, so you don't want to get delayed notifications. And it's just one example of a protocol that in that space, in that example, came from a specific area, the financial sector. But in the end, it's a protocol that's designed to deliver events to consumers. It also has in there this ability of something that calls about exchanges. So it actually has more complexity in it, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So let's ignore that for now. The second protocol that I want to mention here is MQTT. You could say it's similar to AMQP in some sense, in this basic idea of it's a protocol that was designed to deliver certain messages from producers to consumers. Like AMQP, it also has an idea in there of kind of message exchanges. Let's also ignore that for now. The difference here is just that MQTT comes from a very different background. So it has been designed as a protocol for very low footprint devices. So something like those temperature sensors I was talking about. And the idea here then is that you can deliver events through that protocol as well. But if we look at those two protocols, right, they're just at the level we looked at them for now. They're just protocols that deliver an event from a producer to a consumer. Now, this is a little bit tricky sometimes because when the consumer is not around, you may miss events. And when there are many, many consumers, maybe the producer gets overwhelmed by having to service all these consumers. So a pattern that you see a lot that is used in event architectures is to avoid this direct connection from the event producer to the event consumer, and instead have some kind of event queue in there. right? And that event queue then is a piece of software. You can call it a message exchange or a message broker or an event queue. There are many names how you can use that. But at this level, when we still just look at one producer and kind of one consumer or a set of consumers connected to that one consumer, it's mostly all about offloading load from the client. And it's also making sure that if that is something that you want to support in that scenario, for example, event queue will store events and will allow clients to catch up reading events, even though they may already have passed in terms of when they actually happen at the producer side, but they can still consume them because they are still present in the queue, right? So we have a little bit of buffering in here. And one thing you see in API environments and API landscapes is that this is not something that every API producer should do individually. So this is something that you should support by, for example, providing some infrastructure that API developers who are emitting events can then use to emit those events to that queue instead of having consumers directly connecting to them. So if you're looking for this kind of pattern, then it already makes sense in API landscapes and API environments to say, this is a supported thing. So maybe, for example, we'll give you something like RabbitMQ. So RabbitMQ, which actually is based on AMQP, would be a piece of software you can put in the middle there, use it as such an event queue, and make it easier for the developers of event APIs to make their events easier to read. It could still be something where it's just a one-to-N relationship. So you're saying, I'm just a producer. I want to have any number of producers, consumers. What's an effective way of achieving that? And you could say, well, you can just put in a RabbitMQ in there. And if that is something that you want to do, then maybe providing that as a supporting building block in your API landscape would be a good idea. So this already kind of gets you a little bit further along those patterns to a stage where your API delivery, your event delivery of the API becomes more reliable. The next thing that you sometime then hear is not just doing this, but kind of going the next step and saying, we have many APIs that emit events, and we actually make that multiplicity of APIs and events all available through one shared event broker. And in that scenario, now you kind of decouple the event production from the event consumption quite a bit better, or more. Let's not say better, more. And that is something that you see a fair bit, right? So this is also something you can do with RabbitMQ, or it's something you can do with Kafka. It's something you can do with many other pieces of infrastructure you can put in there. And in that case, you might have something that a lot of people would say an event-driven architecture, saying that this becomes an important part of your overall landscape design, right? So you could say, now I'm not just giving this individual piece to developers for their individual APIs. I'm really saying, hey, our API landscape uses events as a first-class citizen. It's an important thing for us to manage as part of our API platform. And now what happens is that producers and consumers have an end-to-end relationship. And what becomes more important, and that's, I think, the architecturally important part here, is you now have to think about, how do I even know which events can happen on that broker, right? Because all the events that can happen on that broker, they are the combined set of all events of all the individual APIs, and that can be quite many. And each of these APIs can emit multiple events. And then the question becomes, how do I even find out where to find those things? And then you can go into places like API marketplaces. Maybe you have an event marketplace where you can find out which events are being emitted. That becomes something where you have to think about that, like at the organizational level. Another thing you might have is that you also might think about, which APIs do I use internally and which do I use externally? So for example, if you would say, I am having an event-based architecture internally because that's what I want to do, is that still something that you want to support for externally facing APIs? So for APIs that you design for partners or even for the public. And in many cases, you will see that those APIs are using different mechanisms, different protocols. So they may use things such as WebSockets or server-sent events. And in that case, you really get into this area of thinking about, do we have guidelines that talk about this and say, for internal events, we always use Kafka or RabbitMQ. For external events, we always use WebSockets or something else, right? And then for both of these things, ideally, you would have infrastructure in place that makes it easy for developers to develop APIs for that specific target audience. So for example, if you have event-driven APIs that go to partners or the public, you would have some WebSocket infrastructure, and there is I would say, an emerging set of products there that will help you to build up a WebSocket infrastructure. And there can be other things. So another thing that you may have heard about as part of your API guidelines could be to say, we support a pattern that at least we sometimes use, which is called CQRS. So CQRS means that you design an API by having different API variants, or whatever you would call them, for commands and queries. So CQRS stands for Command and Query Responsibility Segregation. It's kind of a little complicated thing there, but it again is something that maybe in your API landscape, you would say, this is how we design APIs, right? So for example, for commands, for making things happen in an API, we actually use a REST style API. And for events, for things that happen within the API and get messaged to consumers, we use RabbitMQ or Kafka or something else, right? And if you do that, then again, that is something that your guidelines should clearly stay, and then there should be infrastructure that helps with building that so that you can actually make this picture happen across all of your API landscape. And the last level, I would say, of how far you can go with API, with event APIs or with events, let's say. This is something that you may also have heard about. It's event sourcing. So event sourcing is this idea that instead of treating events just as these more or less ephemeral things, you build your architecture really that they become the source of truth, so that your system is designed in a way that you don't keep state in a database. You really keep state by logging all events, and then your application state is the result of all of these events, right? This is, for example, how traditional banking systems work. There is no database that has your account balance in it, or let's say, that's not the source of truth. The source of truth is all the interactions you had with your bank account, and whatever the end result of all these interactions is, that's your account balance. So event sourcing is this interesting idea of saying, I'm going all in on events. Events are the only thing that really matters for defining how my system actually behaves and how my system state is defined. And I think it's an interesting approach. But the one thing that I would like to point out is that I think this is a good approach for certain subsystems. So for example, if you would build the accounting system of a bank, maybe you're going in that direction and say we're using event sourcing as our system design. But it typically would probably not be a good choice for building the whole bank, right? Because you still have a lot of systems in the bank that are around, I don't know, loyalty program, customer information, mortgages, this and that, right? So a lot of other subsystems that make up the bank. So event sourcing, even though it's interesting, I would say, is mostly confined to certain subsystems, to certain spaces within organizations. So it is a choice that you can make, but it is one that typically would not be the the approach that you use for your overall API landscape. And this already concludes a little walk through different patterns for event-driven APIs. What I wanted to do is just give you this idea that events can be used in very different ways. So you may be familiar with this idea of Maslow's hammer, right? Saying that, well, if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And I really love this picture, but I think it's also an important concept to keep in mind, that also in the event space, like in the general API space, there are many different problems you can solve with events, and they have wildly different properties. So always think about, why am I doing this? How does this translate into the best way, how I should do this? Maybe just design a simple single API this way, maybe put a component in between, maybe really have like this event-driven architecture, or go all in with event sourcing. But really think through that, because in the end, what you're trying to do, the Spice Girls questions, right, is you shouldn't try to just use APIs, you should try to solve problems. And the API that you're using and the event pattern that you're using should just be a good fit for the problem you're trying to solve. So don't be too fundamentalistic about that. Try to be aware of what you're doing, try to take a step back and look at, am I doing the right thing? And then I think you'll be on a good trajectory with your events. And with that, I'm done. Thank you very much. If you would like to look at the slides, I just tweeted the link to the slides in my Twitter feed, so you can find it there. It's also here on the slide. The slides are online, so they are web-based. You can just look at them in your browser. If you want to find out more about what I'm doing, you can find me on Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And that's it for today. Thank you very much.